Susan had always been saddled with the label of being the reliable daughter, the one who solved every family problem since she was barely a teenager with her first part-time job. At 32, with a stable career in the financial sector and two young children who filled her life with laughter and exhaustion, she continued to be the financial support for her parents and her sister Jessica. Medical emergencies, overdue bills, home repairs, or even impromptu vacations. Everything ended up being financed by her. What never came was sincere acknowledgement or a word of deep gratitude. Her husband Marcus silently observed this dynamic, knowing that the family's discomfort toward him was no mere coincidence, but a covert racism masquerading as indifference. Susan, however, preferred to remain silent and convince herself it was just her imagination, even though deep down she knew something wasn't right. Over time, it was her own children who began to notice these differences. Jaime, 8, had a sharp eye that absorbed every gesture and every omission, while Tyler, 6, was more naive, but still sensed when something wasn't right. When they spent time with their cousins, Madison and Connor, at their grandparents' house, the inequality was evident. Always new toys for Jessica's children, larger portions of food served with smiles, invitations to outings from which they were excluded. Susan tried to justify it, inventing explanations for her children as if they were simple oversights. But each scene was etched like an invisible wound. It wasn't just an omission, it was the feeling that Jaime and Tyler were seen as lesser members of the same family that should protect them. The first undeniable sign came one afternoon when Susan picked up the children from their parents' house earlier than planned. Upon entering, what she saw remained etched in her mind like an indelible photograph. Jaime and Tyler sitting on the kitchen floor, each with a poorly assembled sandwich, the bread flattened and without even a glass of milk to wash it down. Across from them in the dining room, Madison and Connor were enjoying steaming plates of pasta with sauce and freshly baked bread, giggling like nothing was wrong. The scene was so brutally clear that it took her a few seconds to process it. There was no excuse. When she asked her mother why her children weren't at the table, the response was a stab disguised as indifference. "There wasn't enough food for everyone, honey." Susan froze. Her father didn't even look up from the television, and Jessica, sitting to one side, pretended not to hear. The air grew heavy, as if each unspoken word confirmed what her heart was beginning to forcibly accept, that this wasn't neglect, it was deliberate exclusion. Her children, with the innocence that still protected them, didn't complain. They just ate in silence, as if such treatment were already part of an imposed normalcy. From that day on, Susan began to look at each visit with different eyes, as if she had lifted a veil that had always been there. She began to notice that Jaime and Tyler were systematically the last to receive attention. On the cousins' birthdays, their children received smaller, almost symbolic gifts, while Madison and Connor piled up new bikes, video games, and theme parties. At family gatherings, places of honor at the table were reserved for Jessica and her children, while hers were relegated to the corners in mismatched chairs, like guests of honor. Every detail she had previously overlooked became undeniable evidence that her children were not seen as equals. Marcus had sensed everything for a long time, but kept quiet so as not to hurt her. On more than one occasion, Susan caught him clenching his jaw or averting his gaze when he witnessed some injustice. This restraint made her feel guilty. She had allowed the situation to become normal for years, clinging to the idea that her family, despite its flaws, would never be capable of discriminating against its own grandchildren. But the truth was becoming so evident that she could no longer disguise it. It was like watching a crack widen in a wall. Each encounter revealed a new gap, and she understood that sooner or later everything would fall apart. One such situation occurred during Thanksgiving dinner. The table was laden with turkey, mashed potatoes, and side dishes that reeked of tradition and abundance. Susan had brought homemade desserts, as always, because she knew much of the meal was funded by her own money. However, when it came time to serve, she noticed how Madison and Connor's plates were overflowing with food, while Jaime and Tyler were given portions so small they seemed mocking. When she tried to add more turkey to Tyler's plate, his mother was quick to say, "Don't overdo it, or there'll be less left over for the others." That "the others" resonated like a cold echo in her mind, as if her children didn't truly belong in that circle. On another occasion, Jessica organized a movie outing with the children. Susan later discovered, through an innocent comment by Jaime, that neither he nor Tyler had been invited. "He said there weren't enough seats," the boy explained, with the painful casualness of someone already accustomed to exclusion. Susan felt her stomach churn. The final straw wasn't the outing itself, but the realization that the discrimination was so obvious that even her children were processing it without complaining. Silently, she began to formulate a plan. She needed proof. She needed to understand the extent of this differential treatment. And so she decided to show up a day earlier than planned, to see with her own eyes what she had long suspected. That day, Susan arrived earlier than usual, parked the car in front of her parents' house, and stood for a few seconds with her hands firmly on the wheel, feeling her heart pounding in her ears. She entered silently, taking careful steps, and what she heard from the hallway stopped her in her tracks. Her mother, in a low but powerful voice, said, "Jessica's children eat first. Susan's can wait. That's how they learn their place." Her father's response was even harsher. "It always was, and always will be. Besides, Susan is our ATM. Sooner or later she'll be back with her checkbook." Those words cut into her like knives, cutting short any illusion that it was all a misunderstanding. Susan stood still, feeling the floor shift beneath her feet. It wasn't just the humiliation of being reduced to a walking wallet. It was the cruelty of confirming that her children were seen as second-class citizens within their own family. She remembered all the times Marcus had remained silent, all the forced smiles from her children, all the awkward silences she had disguised as distractions. In that instant, a mixture of rage and clarity coursed through her. There was no more room for excuses or naive explanations. That day, in that room full of voices that didn't know they were listening to her, Susan understood that the point of no return had been reached. That same night, back home, Susan sat at her desk and opened folders she'd forgotten in a drawer. There were the transfer receipts, the deposit slips, the payment confirmation emails. 8 years of sacrifices turned into cold figures totaling more than $127,000. Seeing the magnitude, she was shocked at herself. She had given so much for a family that didn't even respect her children. She felt like every number was a reminder of the nights she worked overtime, the vacations she sacrificed, the gifts she couldn't give to cover other people's needs. And most painful of all, every dollar was proof that she had nurtured the comfort of those who today despised their own flesh and blood. Determined not to give in to her anger, Susan sought legal and accounting advice. She wanted to understand what obligations she really had, if there was any formal ties obligating her to continue supporting her family. The answer was clear and liberating. She owed nothing. There were no documents compromising her, only a pattern of emotional manipulation that had trapped her for years. That revelation gave her the strength to devise the most important plan of her life, cutting off the flow of money. She cancelled the automatic transfers, stopped her parents' mortgage payments, and decided that within 90 days everyone would have to manage without her help. For the first time, Susan felt she was protecting not only her future, but her children's dignity. The news didn't take long to break. First, it was Jessica, who called her furiously one Monday morning, accusing her of being selfish and of leaving her nephews on the street. Susan listened calmly, without interrupting, until her sister blurted out the sentence that summed it all up. "We always knew you were going to keep paying because you don't know how to say no." That statement, which would have previously plunged her into guilt, now only confirmed that she had made the right decision. For the first time in years, Susan didn't feel the need to justify herself or explain. She simply responded firmly, "My children are no longer going to live off scraps. If you want stability, find it yourself." The silence on the other end of the line was the sign that the dynamics were changing. Shortly after, their parents showed up at their house unannounced. Their mother wept, saying they wouldn't be able to cover the household bills, while their father tried to appeal to their filial duty. "We are your parents, Susan. You owe us respect." She welcomed them into the living room, with Marcus sitting supportively beside her. She recalled every scene in which her children had been treated as less than, and let those memories give her the strength to respond, "I owe them nothing but the truth. And the truth is, until you treat Jaime and Tyler like your real grandchildren, there will be no help." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the firmness that comes from knowing you're protecting what truly matters. The impact of her decision began to be felt immediately. In less than a month, the mortgage on her parents' house was in default, and Jessica had to sell the car Susan had helped her repair so many times. The pleading calls turned into resentful messages, attempting to manipulate her with phrases like, "Family doesn't abandon," or "How can you sleep peacefully knowing we're going under?" But Susan remained steadfast. She slept better than ever, because for the first time she wasn't betraying her own children to support others. This newfound strength came not from anger, but from the clarity of having heard with her own ears what others truly thought of her and the children. The solitude of those days was heavy, but also revelatory. Susan found she had more time and energy for her own family. Quiet dinners with Marcus, playdates with Jaime and Tyler, silences where there was finally no blame. And in the midst of that, calm, she thought about how many people were experiencing similar situations, tied to toxic dynamics for fear of breaking the habit. If you've read this far, tell me in the comments where you're with us. Sometimes sharing where we're coming from reminds us that we're not alone in these struggles. The collapse came faster than anyone expected. After 60 days without Susan's help, her parents received the formal foreclosure notice. The house they had lived in for more than 30 years would be put up for sale. The facade they had always wanted to present to the neighborhood, one of stability and pride, cracked like glass under pressure. Jessica, meanwhile, was forced to take 2 jobs, one at a store in the mornings and another at a restaurant in the evenings. The woman who had always boasted that she knew how to handle herself was now dependent on her own efforts for the first time in decades. Meanwhile, Susan watched from a distance, with mixed feelings. She didn't enjoy her family's downfall, but she didn't feel guilty either. It was the logical result of years of abusing her generosity. Marcus encouraged her to stay strong, reminding her that every manipulative tear she received over the phone was just an attempt to drag her back into the toxic cycle. And although the family accused her of being cruel, she saw in Jaime and Tyler something she'd never seen before: security. The children no longer bowed their heads when they were with their cousins or feared going to their grandparents' house. Now they knew their mother was willing to defend them at all costs. The first unexpected gesture came from his father. One Sunday afternoon, while Marcus was working in the garden, he saw him approaching slowly, cap in hand, wearing an expression he didn't remember ever seeing on him: vulnerability. He sat silently across from Marcus and, after several attempts to find words, blurted out an almost inaudible, "I'm sorry." It wasn't just a pardon for the debts. It was an apology for the years of contempt, for every time he pretended not to see Jaime and Tyler's exclusion. Marcus, with his characteristic calm, didn't respond immediately. He simply listened, letting the weight of those two words hang in the air. That encounter marked a subtle but real change. Marcus told Susan about it that same night, and although part of her wanted to dismiss it as a simple attempt at manipulation, another part understood that her father wasn't a man who apologized easily. The seed had been planted. For the first time in a long time, Susan allowed herself to imagine that perhaps things could be transformed, not through obligation or money, but through confronting the truth. However, she kept her boundaries clear. A gesture wouldn't erase years of silence, much less be enough to make him open his wallet again. The biggest surprise came from her mother, who for years had been the harshest voice in those conversations Susan eavesdropped on. It was Jessica who, with obvious annoyance, told her that her mother had begun family therapy at the local church. At first, Susan didn't believe it. She thought it was another strategy to gain her trust. But weeks later, when they met briefly, she noticed a distinct change. Her mother didn't avert her gaze, didn't try to justify the past, but rather clearly acknowledged that she had acted wrongly. It was a strange moment, as if the figure who had always inspired fear had suddenly been reduced to a fragile woman, trying to repair the damage she herself had caused. That start of therapy didn't immediately transform the dynamics, but it did open a crack in the wall of indifference. For the first time, Susan saw her mother genuinely try to reach out to Jaime and Tyler, asking them about school, taking an interest in their drawings, and even sitting and listening to them tell stories without interrupting. It was a small but significant change. Susan, though cautious, allowed these actions to speak for themselves. She learned not to trust empty promises, only actions repeated over time, and although the resentment didn't disappear overnight, this new willingness was a welcome respite amid so much pent-up tension. The most symbolic moment came at a small banquet their mother invited them to months later, without the old house or the luxuries Susan had financed. The table was modest, with simple plates of rice and roast chicken. But what really caught Susan's attention wasn't the food itself, but the way it was arranged. For the first time, Jaime and Tyler sat next to their cousins at the same table, with dishes served in equal quantities. There were no distinctions, no condescending glances, no excuses for the lack of food. The scene was so normal for anyone, but so extraordinary for Susan, that she felt a lump in her throat. Marcus watched silently, with a mixture of caution and relief. The children ate relaxed, laughing and talking as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Susan, although she knew there was still a long way to go, recognized in that dinner a gesture of genuine effort. It wasn't a complete repair, but it was a beginning, the first sign that perhaps breaking the toxic cycle had been worth it. Inwardly, she vowed to hold firm to her boundaries. Never again would she allow money to buy silence or her children to be pushed aside. If they wanted to rebuild a relationship, it would have to be on a new foundation, where respect was at its core. After that dinner, Susan understood that true change wasn't immediate, but rather a process of small steps that had to be repeated consistently. Her father began visiting the children more often, bringing them books and sitting down to read with them, a simple gesture but loaded with symbolism. Her mother, although still awkward in some ways, displayed a different disposition, as if she were relearning what it meant to be a grandmother without conditions. Susan observed everything with the prudence of someone who knows that trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but also with the satisfaction of having defended what mattered most. the dignity of her children. In those moments of pause, Susan often thought about how many people remain trapped in similar dynamics for fear of setting boundaries. She herself had waited too long until reality forced her to open her eyes. If this story has made you reflect, support it with a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that saying enough is also an act of self-love. Because beyond the tears, the losses, and the awkward silences, what truly changed Susan's story was understanding that protecting her children was more important than maintaining a bond at any cost. As the months passed, Susan remained steadfast in her resolve. There would be no more transfers, no more bailouts, no more favors that would jeopardize her peace of mind. What she was willing to offer was a relationship based on mutual respect. Every time her parents or her sister tried to suggest financial help, she calmly stopped them and reminded herself that that chapter was over. And although the tensions didn't disappear entirely, they no longer had the power to hurt her. Susan had learned to set clear boundaries and, above all, to uphold them without hesitation. This new balance allowed priorities to be reordered. Marcus and the children occupied the center of her life, with nothing else competing with them. Jaime and Tyler, previously neglected, began to flourish. They participated confidently in school, invited friends over, and stopped comparing themselves to their cousins. Susan, watching them laugh, understood that the true triumph was not having freed her family from economic dependence, but having freed her children from the shadow of discrimination. And in that silent achievement, she found the peace she had sought for years in the wrong places. The day Susan walked back through the door of her parents' house, now a more modest space after losing their previous home, she understood that everything had changed. There were no luxuries, no banquets, but for the first time there was a different atmosphere. Her children were greeted with genuine hugs, with reserved chairs at the table, and with smiles that didn't seem forced. Susan didn't forget the past, but she learned to look firmly at the present. It wasn't about forgiving and forgetting, but about setting clear conditions. She would never again allow her family to confuse love with control or help with obligation. That was the true outcome, a boundary that transformed poisoned dynamics and protected the self-esteem of two children who deserved to grow up feeling valuable. Susan understood that loving her children also meant teaching them that no one can decide their worth. In the end, the lesson was etched in every gesture, every no spoken in time, and every yes offered with authenticity. For many, her story might sound harsh. For her, it was the greatest act of self-love and maternal love. And as she watched Jaime and Tyler sleep peacefully that night, she knew that although the journey had been painful, she had finally found peace. By sharing her story, Susan understood that it wasn't just a personal outlet, but also a way to reach out to those who live similar realities. Many people remain silent out of fear, habit, or the pressure to maintain family ties that actually wear them down. She learned, through tears and courage, that it's not about breaking away from family out of pride, but about saving oneself and protecting those who depend on us. The difference lies in setting boundaries, even when it hurts, because true love should never demand sacrifices that destroy dignity. And so, Susan's story didn't end with an abrupt end, but with a quiet rebirth. Her life didn't become perfect, but it did become authentic. She regained the ability to decide for herself, to look at her children and know that they are growing up with the example of a mother who chose her courage over guilt. That is the most powerful legacy she could leave them, to show that sometimes the most loving act is to say, enough. Because, in the end, protecting who we are and who we love is not selfish, but the most honest way to honor life.